In our next section, we're going to look at the basic initialization of the UCS system, referring to the blade series chassis, the blades, the fabric interconnects. So right now I have a blank configuration on both of the fabric interconnects, which are going to be managing the chassis. We'll log in, go through the initial configuration dialog, talk about what are some of the options that it's asking us, and then let the system boot up. It takes typically maybe 10 to 20 minutes for it to fully initialize. So after we go through the initial dialog, we'll take a break, and then when we come back, we should be able to log into the GUI interface and then actually start the configuration of the system. Okay, so first we're going to be starting from the console port of the switches. Okay, so of the fabric interconnects, and from a physical wiring point of view, this is going to be the same exact thing as a console port that you would see on regular Catalyst, regular router, Nexus switch. So the system has serial console access for out-of-band management. It also has Ethernet for out-of-band management on the management 0 port, just like Nexus does. So this is where we're going to be managing the UCS manager. So typically the same subnet that you have to SSH into your 5K, 7Ks, that's where you would have some sort of jump box that has routing reachability to that segment in order to web browse to the UCS manager. Okay, so we're starting here on the left of the system. Okay, if we take a look back at our physical diagram. So we have the two different fabric interconnects, fabric interconnect A and B, and we have two different console connections to them. So they're two separate physical switches. Okay, first thing it asks us is, do we want to configure the system from the console or the GUI? If we say the GUI, it's going to ask us to configure an IP address on the management port so you can actually web browse into it. Okay, otherwise, if we just say console, then it's going to go through the rest of the dialog asking us what we want to do. Okay, so in our case, we're going to set this up from the console. Okay, then if you have a full state backup and you want to restore like a crashed fabric interconnect, this is where you can do the restoration process. We'll take a look at that later when we talk about backup jobs and scheduling backups and what's the difference between like a full state versus the configuration backup of the system. There's a couple different types. But in our case, we're starting from blank, so we're going to do a new setup. Okay, it says, do we want to continue? Yes. Do I want to enforce password security? So this just means, do I need mixed case, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, letters, etc. Okay, so we'll say no. The default username is going to be admin, so just like in NXOS. Is this fabric interconnect part of a cluster? Okay, yes, it's going to be part of a cluster. It's clustering with fabric interconnect B. And right now I'm connected to the console of fabric interconnect A, so we need to tell it that this is going to be the A fabric. Okay, we give it a name. In this case, I'm going to call it UCS1-FI. And then after each of the individual switches, it's going to append a -A or -B, so we know whether we're on fabric interconnect A or fabric interconnect B. Okay, what's the physical management IP? So the system is going to get 3 IP addresses, one for FIA, one for FIB, and then a shared virtual address between the two of them that is going to be for actually connecting to the web UI. But it's not the same as like an HSRP address or a VRRP. It's an active standby failover where only one of the fabric interconnects is hosting the management plane at a time. Okay, but we'll see that when you make config changes on one, it automatically pushes it over to the other. So it's not active in terms of the data plane or the control plane. It's just for the syncing the management plane, syncing the configuration. Okay, in this case, fabric A is going to be 192.168.0.101 in my network. Okay, net mask is going to be a /22. So 255.255.252.0. The gateway is 192.168.0.1. And then the cluster address, this is going to be the virtual IP that we're going to connect to from the web interface. Okay, DNS we don't need to configure, a domain name we don't need to configure. And then UCS Central, this would be if we had a multiple fabric interconnects, so multiple sets of fabric interconnects that we wanted to control from one interface. So the way the FIs work is that they have a maximum number of chassis that they can physically manage. I want to say it's about 20 for the current configuration. So once you go beyond that number of physical blade enclosures, you need to have an additional pair of fabric interconnects. But then if you want the configuration to be managed under one umbrella, That's essentially what UCS Central is for. Okay, so once we go through the details of UCS Manager, we'll come back to this later and see how do we take service profiles, export them from UCSM to UCSC, UCS Central, and then how can we use those to associate to multiple UCS domains, where the domain is going to be defined by the pair of FIs and the blade chassis that it is controlling. Okay, but in these examples to start, we just have one domain, so we don't need to join UCS Central. Okay, apply the configuration and save yes. Okay, so pretty straightforward, nothing too complicated about the console. Okay, once this is done, we should see FIA return back to the login prompt. Then we're going to go to configure Fabric Interconnect B, but there's not a lot of changes that we're going to make here. We should see that it automatically learns about the other FI through the cluster cable. So there's an auto discovery protocol that's running behind the scenes. And we simply give it the password of the primary Fabric Interconnect. In this case, A is the one we configured first. And it should automatically join the cluster. Okay, this is assuming that the boxes are running the same major code revision. So if they have a different sub-release, it will automatically update the secondary Fabric Interconnect. But if one of them is running version 2.2 and one of them is running version 3.0, then you would not be able to join the cluster. Okay, you'd have to make sure the versions are matching beforehand. Kind of similar to Nexus, like if you do a VPC, you can't be in a VPC if one of the boxes is running version 5.2 and the other one's running 7.0. Okay, it's going to be a mismatch in the negotiation. Okay, but normally if you follow the correct order of operations, the system upgrades everything as a whole, so you shouldn't end up in two different FIs with different versions. Okay, so once the FI is ready for login, so we're going to go over to Fabric B. We're going to configure it from the console. And it says we found the presence of a peer Fabric Interconnect. So over that L1, L2 connection, basically the cluster cable, they're auto-discovering that both of the FIs are there. Okay, so yes, I want to join the cluster. Okay, configure the password of the FI. He's going to log into it and to start to download the config. And then it should also ask us what IP address we want to use on this box. Okay, so the other FI is .101/22. Virtual address is .100. So we need another unique address besides this. Okay, 192.168.0.102, we'll say. Save the configuration, yes. Okay, then what we're going to do is connect to one of our jump boxes. Okay, so in this case, I'm connecting from server 1. And on server 1, we're just going to go to the Windows CLI and then ping this IP address that we're using for management. So from the Windows server, if we look at the IP config, pipe defined, quotes, IP v4, we can see we have the IP address 192.168.0.11. This is the management IP. So we should be on the same subnet as, the same layer 2 segment as 192.168.0.101 and 102. But the .100 address may not yet respond because they're still in the process of actually joining the cluster and synchronizing the config. Okay, we'll be able to tell when the system is ready for login once it starts to reply to ICMP echo replies. Basically, ping the virtual IP. Once you get a response back, then you know it's ready to go. Okay, so I'm going to ping this. We'll leave this continuous ping going. And then when we come back after break, we should see that we get a response, and then we're ready to do the login. Okay, additionally, if we were to connect to the CLI, so let's say we log in as user admin, and then the password I configured. To check the status of the other Fabric Interconnect, we look at either the show cluster state or the show cluster extended state. And what we should ideally see, show cluster extended state. And you can see that there is a tab completion, just like in regular Nexus, and there is question mark. Okay, show cluster extended state. And what this should say is that HA for high availability is ready. Okay, so right now it knows about the two Fabric Interconnects. It knows that A is the primary member, B is the subordinate member. And this is not the same as a primary-secondary role like in the case of VPC. It doesn't have anything to do with the data plane. It's only simply for management, which means that when we connect to the UCS Manager, we're going to be connecting to Fabric A. Fabric A makes the changes and then commits them over the cluster link to Fabric B. But in terms of the actual data plane or the control plane, they're still going to have two separate MAC address tables. They'll have two different fabric login tables for storage. The VLANs we configure will be separate. The vSANs we configure will be separate. So they're essentially physically unrelated boxes. It's just that we have control of them from one management umbrella, which is going to be the UCS manager. Okay, so now that we can see the cluster address is responding, so it's still probably going to take another minute or so before it's 100% ready. So let's go ahead and take a short break, and then when we come back, we'll open up the GUI and then talk about what are the next basic initialization steps of the system.